about 80% of the participants of that battle were either escaped or freed, newly freed African slaves. Um, Puerto Rico was one of the hubs of the slave market, the slave trade, and the Spanish domination of Puerto Rico was very harsh, and it reflected itself in the slavery, and as well as the oppression of other sectors of the population. Many of the Native Americans, the Taino people, had escaped to the central part of the island, and many African slaves had also escaped to the central part of the island. Coincidentally, Lares was also in the central region of Puerto Rico, and by the time that El Grito de Lares occurred, the African population and the Taino population in Puerto Rico was ready to rebel. Um, Ramon Emeterio Betances, one of the leaders of El Grito de Lares, had organized the revolutionary committees, and this was the organization that launched El Grito de Lares. And the revolutionary committees encompassed the rebellious momentum throughout Puerto Rico. And by September 23rd, 1868, uh, became the culmination of all of their efforts since January of that year when the revolutionary committees were formed. Now, what's interesting is that the same momentum that was taking place in Puerto Rico was also taking place in Cuba. And the rebellion, the revolutions of both countries, El Grito de Lares, but as well as El Grito de Yara, was actually called for here in New York City, in a hotel on Broome Street. That is where the Society for the Independence of Cuba and Puerto Rico was formed. And it is where the efforts, or rather the coordination for the rebellions in both countries was launched from. In El Grito de Lares, there were Haitians, there were Dominicans, there were Jamaicans, there were other nationalities. It wasn't just Puerto Ricans, you know.
And Carlito, that's an interesting detail because in all of these uprisings that took place in Mexico, in Dominican Republic, in Cuba, in Haiti, in fact, even the uprisings against Spain, led by Bolivar in South America, we had participation of all of these Haitians, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, Dominicans in every country because people didn't see it like their own particular thing. People saw it as it was the whole continent.
It was a hemispheric struggle, and in Puerto Rico, in the same way that there were these other nationalities. In Simon Bolivar's army, there was a regiment of Puerto Ricans. In fact, many of the officers in Simon Bolivar's army were Puerto Ricans as well as Haitians, as well as Dominicans, etc. And that is simply because what happened in as a result of the Haitian Revolution, it impacted every oppressed country in Latin America, and suddenly there was an awakening. And that is how we have to see the context in which El Grito de Lares occurred. Nations were forming. There was a new consciousness. There was a new way of considering the self-identity. People were no longer looking at themselves as extensions of the oppressor. They were seeing themselves as their own entity, and the Puerto Rican identity had matured to the point as a result of the socioeconomic developments in Puerto Rico, where people started identifying themselves as a nation. Now, I always like to equate the battle that took place on the evening of September 23rd, 1868, very similar to the Paris Commune, and that is because the anger that was festering towards Spanish colonialism came to a head on that date at that hour, and it took the Spanish completely by surprise when they saw the African slaves rebelling inside of the city, when they heard gunshots and insurgents coming up the hill into the city. Uh, Once that happened and the battle, which took place for about an hour, ended, uh, the Spanish authorities, military and civilians, they were marched through the streets as prisoners of war. And it is when the revolutionaries, for the first time, made the solemn call, which we know today as que viva Puerto Rico libre. It is the first time that it was ever heard. The words most solemn in the Puerto Rican liberation struggle. And to this day, that one event is felt not only in the independence movement, but even in the cultural and psychological construct of the Puerto Rican people. For example, in Puerto Rico, it is a day that's off for everyone. You know, schools are shut down, the post office is closed, and businesses tend to cater to the day. Although they try to expel the revolutionary content of that history, they try to commercialize El Grito de Lares. Um, but nevertheless, they feel compelled by the revolutionary spirit of the day, you know, and there were many amongst the combatants. There were many women like Mariana Bracetti, Lola Rodriguez de Tia, uh, many sisters who were active participants of the movement, but also active participants in the battle. And one, most interesting, event that occurred as a result is that El Grito de Lares, the victory of El Grito de Lares, was short-lived. However, uh, after the battle and once the repression started setting in, there was about 2,000 of the survivors of El Grito de Lares, not only from Lares itself, but throughout Puerto Rico, who converged and managed to find their way to Cuba by hijacking Spanish vessels and by other means. They managed to find their way to Cuba to join their compatriots in Cuba at El Grito de Yara. And it is why um, we celebrate today the poetic metaphor of two wings of the same bird, which is something that was developed by Lola Rodriguez de Tia, and one of the leaders of El Grito de Lares.
So for people who don't know what that means, what do you mean, two wings?
Two wings of the same bird is Cuba and Puerto Rico, but it also encompasses the other nations, oppressed nations throughout the Caribbean, such as Jamaica and Haiti.
It's interesting, Carlitos, because your interpretation of El Grito de Lares is diametrically opposed to what I first heard when I was in college, and it's also opposed to what I heard from Juan Maribras and Ruben Berrios. It's interesting that in your analysis, see, you give the uprising a class content. You say white people rose up, that people were fighting for their interests. They were fighting for social justice. They were fighting against slavery. They were fighting for liberation. As a result of that, they saw that the only way that they could get their liberation, from what I understand what you're saying, was going towards independence and breaking away from Spanish colonialism. Now, it's interesting because I compared that to the vision which people like Juan Maribras who was a very light-skinned, white-looking Puerto Rican, blue eyes, very dignified person and person who I respect very much. And in fact, Juan Maribras, Secretary General of the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, was also Alfonso Beyal, which was the secret name of the Comandante of the Armed Liberation Commandos, which was a clandestine organization within the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, led by Juan Maribras and really coming out after he died. Also, your vision is different from what Rubén de Rios, also who was blonde hair, blue eyed, and so on. The point, those persons tended to talk about the Grito de Lares as if it was a liberation movement for independence from Spain, rebelling against Spain just because they wanted to rebel for independence. And I never really understood when I heard those interpretations, but what motivated these people to go out there and fight? And then with your interpretation, one can see that, yeah, true, people were fighting for independence, but they were fighting for independence because they saw independence as a way of liberating themselves from oppression.
The majority of the fighters at El Grito de Lares were black. They were black Puerto Ricans. And they were not in Puerto Rico because they chose to come over for vacation and stay. They were driven. They were kidnapped in Africa and brought to Puerto Rico. And generations later, they developed an identity that was compatible with everyone else that was in Puerto Rico. The Puerto Rican nation was developed thanks to and a major contributing part by the Africans in Puerto Rico. That's why we dance bomba and plena. And that's why we have salsa today, okay? It is African music, okay? Our food, pasteles, is African, okay? Mofongo is African, okay? I can go on down the line. The reason why my interpretations of the Grito de Lares differ from many, including in the independence movement, is because white supremacy impacted every aspect of society, including within the independence movement of Puerto Rico. When I was a child, when I was growing up, I envisioned El Grito de Lares as a bunch of light-skinned Puerto Ricans on horses looking all gallant.
That's what we all saw. Yeah.
Exactly, because that is the way it was described. But needless to say, how white supremacy also influences our interpretations of history. Most of the combatants at El Grito de Lares were barefooted. Most of the combatants at El Grito de Lares were free slaves who agreed to by the slave owners who also wanted an independent Puerto Rico. And the deal was very similar to the deal that George Washington reneged on with his slaves. Okay? For many Puerto Rican slave owners appealed to their slaves to participate in El Grito de Lares, and in turn they would get their freedom. And that's how many of the combatants arrived to the actual battle at El Grito de Lares. That's not to include those that escaped and found out through the efforts of the revolutionary committees that this was coming about. You know, Puerto Rico, there were Spanish laws that forbid Spaniards to marry, to bring their wives from Spain, white women, to the New World. So what happened was that many of the Spanish colonialists ended up marrying through rape African and indigenous women. Okay, so when you speak of the Puerto Rican melting pot, you know, which I hate, I even hate the notion that there's equilibrium of the Native Americans, the Africans, and the Spanish, because there wasn't. Okay, many of those Spaniards were Moors. They were black members of the Spanish elite. Okay, who came to Puerto Rico to colonize. So in the end, for you to minimize the African component in El Grito de Lares, it's just a continuation of the way things are whitewashed, and the way that the African role in the independent struggles of the Americas what was their contribution? Just like in American Revolution. In the American Revolution, there were many African Americans, but you would hardly ever hear about them. So that is my explanation as to why we have this vision of a Eurocentric interpretation and a Eurocentric vision of El Grito de Lares.
It was against slavery, and it was also against those that were not enslaved but had to work. They had to record in this little notebook that was called La Libreta. The little notebook, all the hours, every single minute had to be accounted for in order for them to get some type of compensation, which I don't know really if it was in money or if it was in terms of food, but whatever compensation was, they were rebelling in against that libreta, that notebook.
And that libreta, by the way, was also for the freedmen.
Yes, that's what I mean.
These were people who were of African origin,
yes,
but were not necessarily slaves.
They were not slaves. They were workers. They were called jornaleros, day laborers. Today's jornaleros meaning. But there's another real quickly a little point that you made there at the very beginning. You said that the African slaves had gone to the mountains, but actually, there's this myth that in Puerto Rico the Taínos were eliminated, that there was genocide.
They were not.
No, what happened is that smart people that they said, well, the Spaniards are on the coast all over the place. I can't go to San Juan, can't go to Ponce, can't go to Macao. I'm going to go to the mountains. And so if you go to Jayuya, Utuado, Lares, the center of Puerto Rico, which incidentally, and there's another program, incidentally, the central mountainous region of Puerto Rico is now Barranquita, Escobedo, and so on. It turns out that whole region has gold. And we've known this since the 1970s when it was stopped, but now because of the economic crisis, they wanna exploit it again. But in any case, the Taínos, tens of thousands of them, went into those mountains. And so if you visit, anybody who goes visiting Puerto Rico today, they go into central of Puerto Rico, those mountainous areas, they're going to see people that look just like Taínos. There's not too much white blood up there. There's not too much African blood. It's interesting. It's a lot of indigenous blood.
For anybody who's on Facebook and has seen my page, I have a picture of my mother. My mother was Taíno, and you will find many Puerto Ricans that look like that, and this. The culture, the language of the Taínos, the traditions, they're very much alive in Puerto Rico. And in every beautiful sense, they've been partnered and blended with that of the Africans that came to Puerto Rico, the Yorubas. And you see that complementary mixture in the culture, in the foods, in the music, in the poetry, in the dance, in everything, and most especially in the fighting spirit of the Puerto Rican people.
Now, Carlitos, to learn history is good because we learn and we find out our roots and so on and so forth. So just to learn about the Grito de Lares, I think in terms of Puerto Rican, or if you're African, you learn about the uprisings that took part here in this country and throughout the Americas against slavery, and it's good to know that. But in terms of for the future, for a practical reason, it's also very important to know because, for example, from your analysis, we could see why the Grito de Lares was almost a success. And incidentally, we didn't go into this point, but one of the reasons why it failed is that there were traitors. There was a traitor inside. There was an informant who revealed that there were plans to the Spaniards, and so they had to advance the date of the uprising, so it didn't come out quite good. But the point I wanna make is that we have to use that vision of a class analysis and what motivates people to rebel. In the future, we want to organize independence for Puerto Rico because one of the problems we have today is that most independence spokesperson, I wouldn't even say leaders, because today it's not like even 20 years ago. We had organizations with thousands of members. Even the smallest organization had like 300 or 400 members. Today, the biggest ones have maybe 200 members in Puerto Rico, 300 members, whatever. They are not able to mobilize thousands of people, and this is because they've gone away from what we pointed out. They're no longer presenting independence as an alternative for working people, as was done back in the 1970s and up until the 80s. They're presenting independence just as something cute, something romantic, something that is, or something that is just for Puerto Rico independence, but they don't make the link between the struggle for independence and the struggle of justice for the working class. As a result, there is no independence movement.
Well, I'm not going to get into what is it that Puerto Rican groups and individuals are not doing. Okay, I never get into that because I don't criticize people for the tactics that they choose, to fight. However, I will point out, what is, the historical, the principles of our historical mission, and that is that it's U.S. imperialism that's fundamentally the problem. Because if U.S. imperialism did not exist, then any tactic that you use to move forward would be correct. Okay, but because we have, and if you look at the civil rights movement, this is correct. Because we're going to have differences anyway. But as long as you have the U.S. government, the U.S. imperialists there playing on our differences, then that's where the problem is. There was a betrayal at El Grito de Lares, but there were other factors. Spain dominated the sophistication of the tactics of war. Okay, the Puerto Rican people were. This was a new experience. They were infants in the struggle for national liberation. They were not yet matured enough to overwhelm a historically experienced tyrant. So there's many factors. There's many factors that that we can allude to in the failure of El Grito de Lares. But El Grito de Lares did achieve one victory, and that is that it affirmed the existence of the Puerto Rican nation and the necessity to continue the struggle until we achieve national liberation. Y que viva Puerto Rico libre.
Oh, my son, that I, you told me that you cup in there, open the door. I love knowledge.
And that was Angel Canales, one of my favorite artists from the salsa of the 1970s. You're listening to La Voz Latina on WPAI 99.5 FM in New York.
And Carlitos, we're going to be speaking about Bernie Sanders and his version of socialism, and also what his plans for Puerto Rico are, and also what